So my name is Joe Tart, and I'm a native of Sumter County, Alabama. I grew up in Livingston. I want to speak about two influences that back up this collection of photographs that you're going to see. The first would be my great aunt, whose name was Ruby Pickens Tart. She's a very well-known figure in American folklore now. Just after the turn of the century, when she was a young woman, she began going around Sumter County and neighboring counties and locating as many former slaves as she could find, and she would spend the day with them and listen to their narratives, and then go home at night and write the narratives out. And she wrote them in the dialect as best she could. The other influence I want to mention is the photographer Walker Evans. Particularly, I became aware of his work when he came down with the WPA project with James Agee and photographed around Greensboro, mostly in Hale County, and they produced the well-known book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which is a really famous book. Agee wrote the text, Walker Evans took the pictures, and so not only was I influenced by him because of his photography in this area, but because of his approach to photography. He was very adamant when he taught photography to insist that his students did what at the time was called straight photography. And that meant before you make an image, you think it out, you compose it in your mind, you make one exposure. You don't, it's not like you can't work with a motor drive and take a whole lot of pictures and then go back and choose the best one. You get to make one, and you do all of your cropping in the camera. No cropping when you get back to the dark room, and no fair changing the exposure all around. He was interested in straight sort of social realism documentary photography. And I think when you look at my pictures, you probably see some influence from that. The photograph really begins in a person's mind, and after you see something, and then you start thinking about how to make a photograph. I'll talk now about a woman who was really important in my life. Her name was Sally Jenkins. Sally grew up in a little area in Greene County. She grew up in a small town. I don't think maybe it had one store, called Tishoby. She was hired by my family in about 1943 when my younger brother was born. And she stayed with my family for approximately 40 years. I always like to joke that Sally was so important in our house that, you know, if I couldn't find my baseball glove, I didn't go and ask my mother where it was. I would yell and say, "Sally, where's my baseball glove?" And she would always know. Sally was not educated. I don't know how much schooling she had. Sally had a lot of superstitions. If it thundered and lightning, she would not work. She would go down into what we call the furnace room, which was a small room in our house. It was a little like a basement, and sit in a chair and wait until the thunder was done. Of course, we teased her about this, and she said the Lord was doing his work, and she was not going to work when he did. And this is an important picture because this is Sally's bottle tree. Sally collected bottles at our house in Livingston. She hung them in a tree. I asked her about these bottles and why she hung them up there, and she said, "I hang these up there because when the evil spirits come toward my house, they jump in a bottle instead of coming to my house." Later in her life, she wanted to go back to Tishoby and live around her sisters. Her family lived in a little commune. There was a couple of little small houses, 2 or 3 house trailers, and she was very happy there at the end of her life. Conjure woman, which the word is spelled Cunjar. It's a word that comes from conjure, for the word we know of is conjure. So it's frequently called a voodoo person. Around Louisiana, it's called gris-gris. Traveling in the South and you see bottles stuck on a tree, that sometimes is the sign, I'm told, that a conjure woman or a conjure person lives there. It's a kind of secret sign among blacks. So Sally was said by some to be a conjure woman, and the only example I know of with Sally was that she got into a controversy with our yard man one time, and he was a warlock, and he apparently had put a hex on her house, so she told me, to make her have to leave. She said, I knew how to deal with him. And so she went around her little house, which was behind where we lived, and dug holes under each window and put some lye in it. And she said that would nullify the hex. Now, this is another conjure woman who lived in North Sumter County. I went by her house one day, and as you can see, it's just a mess in the yard. This woman was a conjure woman that I had heard about, and I went to visit. She lived in Sumter County over near the Mississippi line. When I went to see her, she was holding what is obviously a paperweight, and she told me that this paperweight had fallen out of the sky and landed in her front yard, and that she had gone out to get it, and somebody had put poison in the frost that was in there in the early morning, and that the frost had poisoned her feet, which indeed were completely kind of flat, and she could hardly walk on them. So she paid a price for being able to pick up this object, which to her came from the heavens, and that's how she was able to tell the future. And in this photograph, my wife was at the time pregnant with our first child, and I asked her whether my child was going to be a boy or a girl. And of course, she had a 50% chance of being right, but she said it was going to be a boy, and she was right. This is a photograph of a pretty well-known southern plantation mansion called Thornhill, and it's in Greene County, just outside of Bologee. This house was built by a man named James Thornton, who came down into Alabama, I believe in 1822, from Virginia, and bought up some land and built this home. And he later became, I believe he was the Secretary of State of Alabama. And then the house and the land, it was about 5,000 acres of land, was passed down through the family. It was eventually inherited by James Ennis Thornton III. My grandmother married him. It was her husband had died when he was young, so this was her second husband. She married into this family, and I spent many, many, many days and hours at Thornhill. This is a curious item. This is the actual slave bell that is behind Thornhill, the mansion, and it's still there. This was a big working plantation. It's real near another well-known southern plantation mansion called Rosemont. These are all between Bologee and Demopolis. You go Bologee, Forkland, Alabama, Demopolis. I'm just going to go through some random pictures around Sumter County. This is a pretty typical photograph of a black home in Sumter County. You know, it would be a tenant farmer's home. Here's another tenant farmer's house, pretty typical. And as you'll see in later ones, there's always a few dogs in the yard. Here's a new crop of corn coming up at a tenant farmer's house just outside of Livingston. Here's a pretty typical picture of what was probably a sharecropper's home. Here's a house near Livingston, the kind of houses that are still there today. This is a black church near Belmont, Alabama, which is west of Livingston. This is the interior. I'm not sure if it's used anymore, but we thought it was beautiful and honest. Here's another one in Hall, Alabama. This is a black church near Geiger, which I really like because it's such a simple, honest bit of architecture. This is Geiger, Alabama, and that's just about what it looks like today, and this picture was made in the early 80s. This is Bologee, Alabama, which is in Greene County, near the Tombigbee River. Almost all of the buildings, except perhaps that one, are empty now. The train track goes right through town, and it used to stop, but doesn't any longer. This is an interesting picture because it's the area in Livingston where the blacks were It's not so much that they were allowed. There was no law that they had to sit there, but that's just where they went to sit. And it was near the Board Well in Livingston, and Livingston was famous for a well that was in the middle of town that produced an artesian water. And they built this large sort of Gothic-looking structure around it, and it was famous enough so that I think back in the 30s and 40s, maybe even the 50s, the Southern Railway trains would stop in Livingston and fill up a whole lot of bottles with this supposedly healing water and sell them on the trains. This is a photograph of my father's store in Livingston. It was a lumber store. We sold lumber, building materials, and then later on the right-hand side, an addition of a feed store. It was the only store in town similar to that, so it was very busy, and I worked there during the summertime. Here's a woman working on her wash outside of her house in Livingston. This is in Selma, Alabama, and this is a black establishment. They do automatic saw fitting, income taxes, sales and service on Poland, saws, putting an edge on things, and working on mini bikes and go-karts. This sign, to me, is very interesting because what does the overall image make you think of? A Ku Klux Klan outfit. You think of the shape. But actually what it is a little sign put up by the church choir. This is the little town of Epps, which as the river traffic died in Alabama, it completely dried up. These are two more images from Epps, Alabama. Very few people live there now. I have a particular like of what I guess we could call vernacular architecture that you see when you drive through the South. This is someone's mailbox. To me, it's a work of art. It's a great piece of sculpture, but it was made for completely utilitarian, non-artistic reasons. I mean, look at this building. Simple, unadorned. It's corrugated tin, but it's absolutely perfectly balanced. It's like a Zen building. Here's a little girl in a cemetery near Gainesville, Alabama. She saw me taking pictures in the graveyard, and she stood there, and I said, "May I take your photograph?" This is a photograph of a man named William Wynn. I was glad to make this. There were three black men in Livingston who were big and strong and known occasionally to get into fights. William was one of them. There was another one whose name was Fats. And Fats was big and strong and probably weighed close to 300 pounds. And then there was another one, another man named Jitney, who probably was part Indian because he was kind of reddish in complexion. And Jitney was very quiet and always stayed off to himself, and people were fearful of him. But we as young boys had many, many arguments about which one of these men would win in a fight. Just over and over again. We'd make bets about it, and they never had a fight. I don't really remember who these guys are, but as you can tell, particularly in this picture, they've obviously been out doing a little drinking. These are three people in Bologee, Alabama, and what I think about with pictures like that is how much there's just a lot of dignity in these pictures. This is a woman, I call her the clapboard girl because of the can, but she's just out in her garden next to the house. These two young ladies they're in Bologee, Alabama. It's a young girl. I believe this little girl was at near Doc Reed's house and is doing something with the shovel. Here's a man in just outside of Livingston with, again, he's got collard greens in his garden and a dog. And this is a photograph of my friend Bobby Stewart, who was he paid his way through college riding bulls and rodeos. And at this point in his life, he was a welfare worker, and I drove with him one day on his, what he called his route. We interviewed people, and so he's talking with an old man on his front porch. I like the woman who's overlooking it. She has a look like she wants to make sure that everything's all right, and what is Mr. Stewart saying? The expression on this man is very difficult to read. Here I am, I'm a white man, I drive up to him and say, can I take your picture? And to me, the image sort of says, what does this white man want? I mean, why does he want to take my picture? Am I in danger? But he looks dignified. He doesn't really look afraid, but he looks ready. This is an interesting picture to me because this photograph was made in Epps, Alabama. It's right on the banks of the Tombigbee River, and I was photographing around there one day, and he walked up with this new shotgun, and we talked for a minute, and I asked if I could make a photograph of him, and he said sure. So he stood there, and he stood in this posture, and now when I looked at that photograph later, I think this says so much about the importance of the viewer's perspective when one looks at a photograph. If I showed you that photograph and said it was from Rwanda, you would have a completely different take on what's going on in this photograph. The boy's face, to me, is very difficult to read. There's a lot of dignity in his face, but is he angry? Is he? He wasn't angry, I know, because I was there. But if it were a photograph from Rwanda, I think the normal person would be a little fearful of this guy standing there with a shotgun. The fact is, he had just gotten this shotgun as a gift from his family, and he was using it to hunt and to provide food for his family. And he was extremely proud of it and happy to have me take a picture. I sent him a copy of the picture.